I think the simple answer, I like to, it is a cliche, and if you fail to plan, we plan to fail. And unfortunately, in a field such as education, I feel very strongly that failure is not really an option that we can afford. Students are way too important, their education is way too important, and if we recognize that, it is the onus is on us to invest time and energy in planning. A small example that actually happened a few months ago to set up my answer to your question. A few months ago, the mother of one of our best students, this student was very, very high academic credentials, very good academic credentials. She came over to our department and pretty much grilled me for 1 hour because she wanted to know what exactly her son is going to learn in the program. And there was another person in the department at the time, and we tried to give some arguments about, oh, he will get his degree, and after the degree he will do this, that, and the other. And she wasn't having any of that. She just said, tell me very specifically what he will learn and how is it relevant to industry.
Well, I think it's important because the best assessment programs involve a lot of people. And so it's a little like organizing the army on a trek. So you want to make sure that you don't have everything really done by top down by one person. So I think the first thing you have to figure out is how to spread it around as much as possible, as early as possible. And that means thinking about who would be good at various jobs that have to be done, who you can depend on, who would know something about data collection. And so you need to have a plan of battle, as it were, ahead of time, and you need to have a kind of organizational chart. So I think planning ahead is really important.
The assessment process as one that is on a timeline that involves multiple activities that need to be synchronized across the two endpoints, one when you start with the research question and one when you actually have data to inform the question that you started with. So if you do not plan ahead of time, you may end up at the end of it without the kind of data that you needed to start, and then it makes the entire process futile. So I always think of the assessment process as a research project that one would do for a publication or a dissertation, and the need to plan that process ahead of time, anticipating the things that you will need as you go down the line is so crucial to the success of the assessment process. And I think, too, if looking at it from my vantage point of a director of assessment, I would say that a lot of faculty and the university, when you go to get buy-in from them for these various aspects of what you do, you have a lot of eyes that are watching this process. And if you engage them in activities that don't yield the proper results or the stated results at a given point in time, you risk losing that buy-in. You risk your reputation, sort of, not your reputation, but your standing as a professional. And so I think you're engaging multiple people, multiple processes, and a lot of resources. And so it is important that you plan that process out so that you bring all of these and orchestrate them to achieve your end goal at the end. So I think planning ahead of time is very crucial. But as we all know, with all research projects, you cannot anticipate everything that will come up. But it's best, on account of that you kind of at least cover yourself for things that you can potentially plan for in that process. Are students learning? I think that's the fundamental question that drives any form of assessment. the other important question, if I were to choose two, the other one would be, is the institution achieving or is it delivering on its mission and its stated objectives to the students and to our stakeholders? And so I think those are two overarching questions that any assessment professional, or that underlies why we do what we do. And thereafter, you can ask, questions of, are students advancing in critical thinking versus written communication, and those become subsets of your thing. But I think if I were to think of two large questions as to why we do what we do, I think that would be it.
The number one question, the question that underpins good academic assessment is, are the students really learning what we say we're teaching them? And in a sense, going back to the first question, I think that's something that you have to talk about right away with people. You have to think about that, because people will say, well, I already grade the students. They've got grades. And I think the whole idea that what we do in assessment is that we assess programs. And we try to see, by setting goals for the programs, we try to see whether our programs are actually meeting those goals and whether the students are actually learning what we say we're teaching them. I think the second part of that is, once we have our data, what can we do about it? If we see areas where we think, oh, the students don't seem to be learning as well as we thought they were learning how to write research papers, then we have to ask, how do we find out ways of improving? How do we improve the way that students are learning?
The most important question is, am I being effective as a teacher? And so first you set out your learning objectives. And so, for instance, in teaching an intermediate level history course, my learning objectives may include things like having students read primary sources and learn how to critically read them and ask really good questions. And so in looking at both what kinds of materials I might provide to students, how I might suggest to them and guide them in how to use them, I can then help that process along. At the same time, I can also look at what my learning objectives are against what they're doing and be able to sort of measure how that might work. And sometimes it's easy to see students, sort of the light bulb goes on, the aha moment happens. Other times not so much. But I think it's really important starting out to really have a good sense of where you want to take them before you begin the journey. I think that leads back to learning objectives. And if you, for instance, the example I just used, I was probably less interested in content acquisition as much as I was interested in having students learn skills. And so my questions would be focused around the skill acquisition as opposed to the content acquisition, which would really be a different set of questions.
From my experience, and I've worked across the university and thinking about university assessment of general education, for example, but the most work I've done is developing the English department's assessment program, and we were very early for our university in developing it. I think there, the questions really become goals, and people need to keep going back to goals, because I think you can, once you start collecting data, you can drown in oceans of data, and you can look at all those rubrics, and sometimes you can forget what it is that you're trying to do with all that data. So I think the questions are important because sometimes they bring us back from the labyrinth of data.
If I am predominantly interested in looking at skills, the kind of question I might ask, the question I'm framing when I'm preparing my rubric might be something along the lines of, is a student able to identify an argument? Are they able to make judgments about evidence? Can they create a counter-argument? Whereas with content, then that's a very different kind of knowledge. And so in that case, it would be more important for them to understand, say for instance, in the case of a primary document, who's creating it? What is the background of that creation? Are there any political, economic, social, ethnic reasons why the person creating the document would frame it in a particular way? You can still look at things like argument and evidence, but you're going to look at them very differently if you're assessing for skills as opposed to content. And they're not mutually exclusive. You can really look at them together, but certainly you're going to frame your question slightly differently, I think.
So one of the things I tell my faculty in faculty development workshops are, when you want to ask a question of performance, right? When you're asking that fundamental questions, did students learn? So you're going to resort to more direct forms of assessment, where you're looking at something that is performative, something that is observable within a given space, and something that is accessible as well. Whereas if you're asking, as a result of that process, if you determine that students did not learn, or then you're going to ask the question why they did not learn. And I think that's when you're going to resort to the indirect forms of assessment, which tend to be a little more qualitative in their approaches, where you could think about focus group discussions, you could think about surveys, post-semester surveys, you could do a post-capstone survey, where you're asking these questions and asking students, what do you think went wrong? You know, what do you think we could have done better? Why do you think this did not work for you? So that leads to more indirect forms of assessment, because it doesn't tell you whether students learned, but it can answer questions as to why.
I can remember one very instructive moment. This was very early on in the English department's attempt to find a good assessment, and this was a very painful experience. So I think there were 3 or 4 of us on the assessment committee, and one of the things that I take responsibility, because I'm the person who kept saying, we don't have to reinvent the wheel here. There is so much research about assessment, and so many other institutions have done assessment. All of us will go out, do research, we'll look at websites, we'll find out, you know, all these different systems. So we did, and we all got assigned to our research, and we ended up being very impressed by a system that was done at a large Midwestern university. It was complicated, but we thought, wow, they really ask great questions. And I think what happened is the 3 or 4 of us who are spending our time looking at all these different assessment possibilities and thinking about what would suit us, we got carried away by our own enthusiasm for all these great questions and apparently interesting results. So we adapted it and brought to the whole department what I now realize was an excessively complicated and horrendous way of doing assessment. And when we brought it to the department took one look at it and said, we're never going to do this, ever. And I was the department chair for 10 years, so I was really responsible. So I felt, this is really bad. But the more I thought about it, the more I realized that the wisdom of the department was right. And we were going to get ourselves into the most picky, labor-intensive kind of assessment imaginable. And I think it probably worked for that big Midwest university because they actually had a huge department and many students. So they could probably divide up the work, and it probably wouldn't have been so onerous for them. We have 17 tenure-track people in the English department at Framingham State. So we needed to home grow something that was much better suited for us. So after I'd gone home and licked my wounds, I realized I just learned something really important, that you really have to adjust to your size and who you're working with, and you can't just come to the department and say, look at this really great idea we're all enthusiastic about on the assessment committee. What you have to do, first of all, is you have to start at the beginning, and as I said, starting out, you really have to go around and talk to people and figure out what people like to do and how that sort of thing can work for the assessment. So I think what we ended up doing, and it's interesting because we often end up doing this sort of thing at Framingham State, I've been involved in a number of other campus-wide projects, is we realize at some point that we do have to home grow.
I guess the conditions under which you encounter such problems, from my vantage point, are sometimes I may inherit an assessment plan from a previous director of assessment, and that may not have put that much thought into it, and so you're encountering or trying to implement a plan that leads to a little bit of frustration and futility because you're working. So sometimes when you do inherit such a plan, then you're still stuck under conditions that you have to develop sufficient momentum to go ahead and change. One such example that I encountered was that, and this may not have been the result of the plan itself, but of the way the curriculum was set up. We had identified oral communication as an important skill of Gen Ed, and that could be assessed in certain courses. So when I was charged to assess that objective, I looked at the curriculum and I looked at the number of courses at the university that were being offered that were linked with this particular objective. And what we found was that there were about 4 or 5 courses that were offered from the communications department that were identified with this objective. So when we're thinking of trying to do institutional assessment there, it's really program assessment because it's tied to one particular department. And so therefore we had no need to pursue that at that point in time other than to stall that, prior to start engaging that that assessment project, to rethink how we offered that and to rethink how we coded our courses with that particular objective, and then to also ask ourselves, is this objective sufficiently embedded through the entire curriculum for us to claim that it is an institutional objective if it is actually coming out of one department in the university. So that was, I would say, a good example of planning something within a plan without giving thought to the infrastructure or the curriculum or the conditions that can facilitate the efficiency of assessing that particular objective at that given point in time.